Hi there, everyone. We've got a couple more minutes before we start, and there's a few more people joining. So we'll start at 11. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Supply Chain Resilience Beyond the Impact of COVID-19. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you are all staying healthy and well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kimberly Allen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Aravo Solutions. We're a leading provider of third-party risk management and supply chain risk and resilience software solutions. And I'll be moderating today's conversation. Just before we start today's discussion, just a little bit of housekeeping. We do encourage participation in the form of questions and commentary. You should see a little control panel on your screen. The little orange arrow there opens and closes this. To submit questions and comments, just pop them into the questions box, submit them, and I'll relay them to the speakers. So today we'll be framing a lot of our conversation around this concept of bouncing forward rather than necessarily falling back into the same old way of doing things. This is how true resiliency is built. We have an opportunity to do things differently and explore new ideas to really improve supply chain and operational resilience. And I'm really privileged today to be joined by some excellent speakers who bring a wealth of experience with them. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Ralph Petty. Ralph is the Principal of Operations at Readiness Associates. He's a certified disaster recovery specialist and has over 30 years of experience with Fortune 500 companies, government and non-profit organizations, and also with many multinational firms to provide enterprise risk minimization planning solutions. He's been involved in the planning and recovery for a multitude of clients during events as wide-ranging as the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 and other regional earthquake events, to the 9/11 tragedies, and has also developed pandemic plans for several countries in Asia. Ralph's favorite saying is nobody wins unless everybody wins, a perfect saying for today's conversation. So welcome, Ralph.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Also joining us today is Dr. Erin Huey. Erin is the Director of Global Operations at the Pacific Disaster Center based out in Hawaii. For over 20 years, Erin has dedicated her academic and professional life's work to advancing evidence-based practices in the field of disaster management. Leading Pacific Disaster Center global efforts, she has developed the foundation for the largest operationalized national and subnational risk and disaster preparedness assessment. The breadth of her career spans hands-on response operations at local, state, federal, and international levels, to the development of regional and global policy focused on disaster risk reduction. Erin received a PhD from the University of South Florida and currently serves on the board of directors at Georgetown University in the Disaster and Emergency Management Program. Aloha, Erin, and welcome.
Aloha, thank you for having me today.
And last but not least, we welcome Eric Hensley. Eric serves as Chief Technology Officer here at Aravo Solutions. He has over 15 years experience in the development and delivery of enterprise SaaS offerings with a special focus on supply chain management and intelligence solutions. So prior to joining Aravo in 2008, Eric was instrumental in developing technology solutions for processing the majority of food service transactions in North America. and also the development of MTML and XML transactional document standard, now widely deployed in the shipping industry. Welcome today, Eric.
Good morning. Thank you.
I'm really excited today to be joined by such a great panel. And remember, they're going to be taking your questions too. So please don't be shy about submitting them over the course of today's discussion. And hopefully at the end of the discussion, we'll have a little bit of time as well for questions and responses. So really just to set the scene for today's discussion, it's obvious that we're all living through really exceptional times at the moment with COVID-19. The pandemic and its associated impacts has really exposed a multitude of vulnerabilities in supply chains. And these are vulnerabilities that many didn't even know that they had, let alone had prepared for. Indeed, Fortune reports that 94% of the Fortune 1000 are experiencing coronavirus-related supply chain disruption. So this really serves as a wake-up call for how we can collectively and collaboratively build better supply chain resilience. But it's not the first wake-up call. We're just going to touch back on some lessons from the past and look back a little bit here. Ralph, you've been advising clients on disaster recovery and business continuity planning for 30 years now. What are some of the impacts and lessons from the past you can share from your experience?
Well, Kimberly, that's a really important question in today's times because we're making history as we go moment to moment with this virus on a global basis. We need to learn from the current lessons. So when something happens, you have to take notes, you have to reach out to professionals, you have to follow the regulations and rules to make sure that you're following, because we all know the theme of this event is about supply chain, and we just want to make sure that everybody's supply chain is intact. So you have to constantly plan internally with your supply chain vendors. You need to make sure that you're emphasizing quality, safety, access. Pricing may have to move over aside a little bit because you want to do what's right for everyone on your team. You always have to have secondary or tertiary plans in place to make sure that your people are available to go no matter what. If you own a coffee shop and your milk supplier, to simplify things in its least tangent, is not available to respond to you, then you have to have somebody else who's going to deliver the milk. And we've seen so many examples of supply chain issues with Target trying to expand too quickly in Canada. These are all public references. General Motors starting with robotics back in the 1980s and other events type of things. So you really have to make sure that you're planned and you know what you're doing. So if something does go wrong, there is a plan B.
Right, and Erin, your role sits at the intersection of government and corporate responsiveness. What are some of the lessons and impacts from the past that you can share?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for us to realize is that we have to collectively work as a team. A holistic approach to every element of business and every element of supply chain. And I think more than ever, we're seeing that supply chain and supply chain operations cannot be siloed from everything else that's going on. Supply chain is linked to HR. HR is where we're going. Our human resources is going to be the first step in our supply chain. And so I think one thing that we have to recognize is that we need a cross-cutting approach through all of business so that the supply chain is not seen as this separate item that just brings, goods in and out, but rather is the foundation for the success and growth of business. And we've seen that in many events. And on your slide, you see the 2011 Thailand flood. This was a huge impact for many companies that were not paying attention to the fact that there was significant flooding in the area. And yet some of the primary goods that fed into electronics, that then supported the US government, that then supported, security and safety issues, they're all linked. So if we've learned anything from natural events, it's that we have to take this holistic and really a systems approach from beginning to end.
Yeah, it's an entire ecosystem really that's affected, and I think that sort of draws out the principle of removing things from silos and sort of bringing these into more of a holistic view. So despite sort of these events from the past, it's interesting that, organizations were still very unprepared for COVID-19. Ralph, you've been involved in pandemic planning in Asia. Why did coronavirus sort of catch so many unawares?
I think people just didn't believe it would be this serious. We've had, in the USA, we've been touched by 17 of the last 20 years have had some element of SARS or MERS or Ebola or H1N1, where they were somewhat limited in scope. Some of them stopped at the border of Toronto, some of them stopped at the borders of Africa. But in coming to being a real issue in many of the different areas, both populated areas and some of the rural areas in the USA, it just wasn't hitting home as much as it is right now today, with some of the growth in some of the areas that had not been affected, like the New Yorks and the New Jerseys and the Californias a month or two ago. Now some of the suburban areas are being more affected. The other reason is that there's been a lot of indecision, a lot of social media, a lot of questions. Always the headline is on page 1, the retractions on page 19. So people may hear something, gee, do I wear my mask? Do I not wear my mask? If I wash my hands this morning, is that good enough? So, and there's many, many more layers of communication amongst individuals these days. So I think that people really weren't as prepared as they are. And here we are, hopefully nearing the end of phase 1, but we don't even know today. Will it end? Will it reignite? Will other factors come in? You're in the Southern Hemisphere, Kimberly. Are things going to start impacting you in the Australia, New Zealand area that have impacted us in the Northern Hemisphere, North America? So we don't know what's going to happen. But the bottom line, we still don't have a vaccine. We still don't have a cure, limited PPEs. Everyone's talking about preparing next time. We'll talk more about that in this presentation, but I think we were caught a little off guard, and we'll certainly be more prepared as it comes around again.
Thanks, Ralph. And Eric, why do you think so many businesses were unprepared for this?
Well, I mean, we have a lot of insight into the supply chains that companies set up for their businesses because they're modeled in our various systems. And supply chain efficiency is, the sort of name of the game these days, right? Having deep supply chains, having them just in time, and having them as efficient as possible. Having a resilient supply chain implies a certain durability to it, a certain amount of redundancy, right? And there might be some trade-off of efficiency to that. And so I think that in the absence of the sort of belief that Ralph was talking about there, well, these things are out there, but are they really a problem for me? The people who make these business decisions are going to make them to maximize their supply chain efficiency, until something happens like this. I mean, you see this sort of thinking in all sorts of business areas, and it's totally normal until it's not. I mean, you have to get to a point where real things happen so that you're changing this calculus. And then the people in your business, and a lot of businesses knew that these things were out there. They have, they have pandemic risk people, they have business continuity people, they work with people like Ralph. They know that these risks are out there. It's just how much of a voice do they have in that business discussion?
Again, that's sort of bringing things out of silos in some ways as well. And I think some of the other things, on top of some of their traditional supply chain design, just the interconnectivity and the interconnected risks, that cascaded out of this. One thing that comes up, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is something that was exposed with this lack of visibility into the second, third and nth tier suppliers that were impacted, perhaps before some of your first level suppliers. And Aaron, I think that the human impact, which you sort of touched on before, and people being so integral to successful supply chains, seem to play a role here as well.
Yeah, I agree with some of what Eric was saying. It's normal until it's not. And I think that one of the biggest challenges is that everybody, including the individual and the business, is dealing with the emergency of the day. Mm-hmm. And many times it's very hard to get your mind around how large an event something like this could be. I mean, everybody's near-term experience is related to earthquakes, it's related to tropical cyclones, it's related to some type of natural event that have a definitive start and a definitive end. So that in itself provides security and stability and parameters for decision making that help guide us. Right now, and Ralph was also alluding to it, there is a level of uncertainty. We don't know when it's going to end. We've got some really solid scientific information that tells us it's not going to end tomorrow, right? The 1918 pandemic actually lasted 2 years. So we know that. But how do we effectively cope and plan for this level of uncertainty and understand that this in whatever time period this will be, whether, maybe we'll be very optimistic and say by the end of the year, or whether it's 2 to 3 years down the road, how do we plan for this and other events? And I think the best way to do that is to make sure that your company, even if there isn't clear communication being issued by the government or by another entity, that your company has a solid plan that takes into consideration individuals' level of acceptable risk and the compounding risk. I mean, I've said this many times, but people in Florida think all of you living in, California at risk for an earthquake are just crazy. They would never live with that type of acceptable risk. But you, in turn, would not go down there and, live through their hurricane season. So I think one thing that we are going to see is that as we bounce forward, is a desire for people to learn to better cope with uncertainty. And one way to do that is if businesses can have a bit more certainty. If they have a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term plan, that's going to help the individual family, employment, and overall support the supply chain and business development.
Right. So, the event has happened, and there's sort of the immediate concerns that businesses need to get on top of right away. Ralph, what are some of the first things that businesses should be focusing on now, and what are the sort of hallmarks of a good business continuity plan?
I think everybody should be taking notes right now as best they can. It's been a really strange time. You have a 9/11, and there are horrible fatalities, and things settled politically within a few years, and we moved on. But this is a lingering event of global standards, something that's affecting everyone, and a lot of people don't know what to do. Some people are saying, wow, is the business continuity businesses, our firm Readiness Associates, working really hard, doing a lot of plans and working with people. But we're seeing indecision. We're seeing people losing staff or cutting back and don't have the money to spend, and they're not building temporary facilities that some companies will do. So we're doing, and a lot of people are focused on the healthcare aspect. I think right now everybody's pushing in the same direction. Everybody's trying to get those PPEs and supplies and those policies, procedures in place. The CMS rulings, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, there's a great focus on that right now to make sure that these folks are finding available resources, available funds. And where do you start? You start with what you have. You plan and you enhance and you embellish what plans you have in place right now. I still come across 9/11 or Y2K plans where people put plans in place 20 years ago. But you know what? And I see a few smiles of my colleagues. It's true. I ran across one last year. You're the owner of a company. You make widgets. You're in any town USA, and that hasn't changed. Sure, all the other variables have. But another key variable to consider, which hasn't been mentioned yet, to expand upon the human factor, is the families and succession planning. What do you do if your key people have a special needs child or an elderly parent or someone that necessitates that they stay home to care for them, or if someone in their community or in their household does have the unfortunate opportunity to become a victim of the COVID-19? So what do you do? So there's a lot of emphasis on succession planning, on your supply chain, on your family planning. We look at standards. The 22301 ISO standards are the best bottom line to have for anyone. You do a business impact analysis to understand what your critical applications are. You do a risk assessment of your environment, whether you're in California or in Florida. You've got hurricanes, you've got earthquakes. You kind of accept that and you move on from there. But some of the things that you really can't plan for are the cyber attacks and the terrorists and other events that we see every day. So you want to really focus, again, as we keep saying on every single slide, on the supply chain, because you can control what you have at home, at work, with your employees to a great extent. But when you reach out for your suppliers and they're not there, that's going to be another issue and a dynamic that you could have handled ahead of time and perhaps you did not. So it's just being aggressive, testing, put SLAs in place, service level agreements, and do whatever you can to manage your own house and hope for the best.
Thanks, Ralph. And Eric, one of the things, and Ralph touched on this, that we hear a lot about at the moment is the cybersecurity vulnerabilities, particularly those associated with the shelter in place, work from home conditions that much of the world is subject to at the moment. So your suppliers and third parties may have had the right security controls in place in an office environment, but they may not have these at home. What should businesses be thinking about here in their supply chains?
Well, this is an extension of, standard business continuity planning, but digital transformations like this take a long time. I mean, it takes a long time for IT security professionals to make this transition from, sort of the old existing model of a perimeter, an office IT security perimeter to a no perimeter type layout for all of your systems and for your people. It's continuing slowly, across industries, but it's a maturity thing like any other sort of technological change. And so the idea here is basically to extend your internal plans for eliminating your perimeter, right? Having defense in depth, assuming that, having bring your own device, assuming that your employees are going to be anywhere, and enhancing your supply chain business continuity assessment to include that. Most companies that are beyond a certain size or a certain level of maturity are starting to work on at least their own internal elimination of a perimeter.
Mm-hmm.
This touches on making sure that your business continuity assessment of your supply chain is also appropriately structured to who is in your supply chain. You have to know that you have suppliers to whom this might apply. And like Ralph says, you still have a lot of companies out there with one size fits all business continuity assessment. And so it's easy for me to say, well, take your own internal, plan that you're using for making sure that you don't have any perimeters and apply that to your suppliers. But one, you have to have the facility to be able to, apply that. And two, you have to know who the right suppliers are, both of which are big challenges.
Right. And Erin, the impact of coronavirus today, unfortunately, isn't the only hazard that can impact the supply chain. And I think you know this only too well with some of the early warning monitoring that the Pacific Disaster Center had been tracking regarding cyclones that have been impacting Bangladesh and Australia. What other monitoring and risks, should businesses be considering?
Yeah, this is a very dynamic environment, and I agree with Eric that we need to continue some of those continuity, and one size fits all doesn't work, especially when you look at a global community. So last week, many of you may have seen, we had the largest cyclone on record in the Bay of Bengal as it was headed towards India and Bangladesh. I'm sure off the top of your head, everybody could think of 10 businesses that work or have suppliers in that region. So that type of impact can be very, really be cascading. But I don't want people to feel as if there's no solutions or that it's overwhelming or that they don't have the ability to analyze each piece. So one of the things that we do in support of private industry and in support of the government is identify hazards in real time that are happening around the world. That's your easiest. You don't need to do an in-depth risk assessment. Know typically what's going on in those regions and in what seasons. So we provide that. Also, we're working very closely to make sure that all of the data is evidence-based, right? Not opinion, not hearsay, but distilled so it's actionable. I don't know how many of you that are participating today have seen risk assessments that say somebody has a 0.57 risk of you name it. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how that informs my decision making. So really making sure that it's evidence-based and actionable so somebody can say your risk is higher if you're working in Asia Pacific, or specifically if you're working in this part of Indonesia or this part of, Philippines or China. That is going to give you the information you need to make a decision. And I think that's where the science and business need to come together very effectively so that you can have targeted information. And then the last piece I'll say, just related to early warning and monitoring, we do cover globally. But that's too much for you. That's too much. And you probably care about your home, where your parents are, maybe where your child's going to college, and your suppliers. So what we've put in place is called smart alerting, and you can actually identify the locations you care about, the hazards you care about, and then we'll notify you. Just get a text message or an email or something, that says, hey, keep your eye out for this. But it's specifically important for your employees, right? So as a business, if you know where your employees are now that they're working from home, are you sure they're at home? They might now be in a critical place. Maybe they're helping or supporting, like Ralph talked about, having to go support a loved one, across the country or somewhere else. So I think there's a lot of ways technology and science in particular can provide solutions for businesses, and it doesn't need to be complex. It really doesn't.
Yeah, and also that additional peace of mind, which it can contribute as well.
Yes.
So thinking about sort of bouncing forward. Actually, I've just gone too far forward. I'm bouncing a little too far forward. So as we come out of sort of sort of these short-term dynamics, which are a little bit more based around crisis management and juggling the immediate effects of the virus and business continuity, into planning and preparing and setting plans in place for the future, there's opportunities to be thinking about what can be done differently. So, Erin, where do you see the most room for improvement?
I love your third bullet on here, right? Better quantification of risk. And to take that just a step further, it's better communication of risk. And I think people need to understand, really the difference between accurate and precise. And many times, large businesses need to have accurate information about the general risks of those areas. I don't necessarily need to know within, 3 decimal places what the risk is, but accurate information, but actionable information, I think, is the biggest piece. And that moving forward, I think, is going to be most important for developing these long-term plans. And I think a new conceptualization of how we work with our suppliers, because our suppliers will be, the death of us or the benefit of us to, how it grows, how we grow as a business if we don't have solid suppliers. So I think new approaches to understanding that our suppliers in general are competing with paying payroll, paying rent, and paying their general bills. How do we work as a collective system on that? But a lot of areas for growth. I really want to recommend everybody take it step by step, short, medium, long term, and know that it is doable. Don't feel overwhelmed by it.
Great, thank you, Eric. Ralph, what advice would you be giving clients as they move into this next phase of response?
Well, I want to go back to a point that Erin just made regarding the testing and making sure that you have certain assurances. I just want to reiterate that point because it's so critical. You can do a test, a recovery test, an awareness test with different suppliers, which makes a lot of sense, and have a wonderful A-, get a 95% rating on that test. But we're only looking at the 5% that you failed. Or if you're at 98%, you're looking at the 2% that you failed, because if you've got a series of dominoes lined up and one of the dominoes goes astray, you're just not going to have all the dominoes fall down at the end of the line. So going back to that point about quantifying your risks, your alternate suppliers, resiliency, I'm just reading on the screen in front of me what we've discussed today so far. But all of these points about supply chain are really, really coming to the forefront right now because of the shortage of certain equipment. Forget about your political persuasion. Everybody's got a different opinion of things, but you've got a situation where you've got materials that are sitting perhaps in cargo ships off the coast of California that are needed somewhere, but there may be a crewman that has the COVID-19 or be suspected of such. They're building large facilities in cities and they're waiting for people to come in, and the people aren't showing up, and they're spending a lot of money to dismantle them. So we're doing as best as we can an accurate advice on what to do on the front end, and we've got to learn from that. So every company is different. Every company is unique. Every industry is different, as Eric said earlier. You have to understand where you are, what you're doing, learn from your competitors, learn from different associations, learn from different groups, educate your team. Every single employee is critical. Every single employee needs to know the where, when, how, what, and why. If there's a fire, they need to know what the congregation point is, or else they're going to be going to look for Mr. Petty, and he's not here. Where did he go? Oh, he just went home. He lives 4 blocks away, but that's not good enough. And the suppliers, as you're saying, have to be accountable also for the fact that they've got to make sure that they've got what they need to do to be there for you, and you have to build that in. So I've had the pleasure to be invited by the International Medical Corps to do pandemic planning, and my two favorite places were the Philippines and also the Republic of Indonesia. And in both cases, I went there and I had my headset on like you're at the UN. I don't speak Indonesia, they don't speak English. And we had a very engaging conversation, but the stories that they told and the issues that they had of those island nations were remarkable with the importing restrictions and incidents they have. So you look at places that do less importing, like perhaps some of the countries in North America and such, and they have different peculiarities of what they're looking for. But the key is that everyone has to understand what they're doing, make sure they're doing what they can, and have the opportunity to fix that if they can with a quick fix that's been tested before. So last point, when you're doing your testing and you're working with your primary supply chain partners, just take a moment and work with your secondary supply chain partners or your tertiary supply chain partners, or reach out a little further and find out who your secondary supply chain partners are. You know, you can think and think and think, but you've got to really do your diligence to make sure everybody's fine. That's a critical point to be made. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. And Eric, what opportunities do you see for organizations to improve?
Just continuing on what Ralph said there, I mean, taking a moment to do that, I mean, it's important because that's where your problems are going to crop up, but it can be more than a moment. Even small companies can have supply chains at depth now. I mean, we have mid-sized companies with hundreds or thousands of suppliers in the Aravo system, you know, hundreds of them. And so the ability to manage your supply chain at scale is important for this, but also it's important to not become overwhelmed by it. Aaron talked about actionability. Actionability is critical here. There's enough systems and data in the world, right, to keep this from being a manual process where you have to analyze manually with your spreadsheets who all of your suppliers are, and then analyze manually with more spreadsheets who their suppliers are. There are enough systems in the world, and somewhere in your company will be all of that data. Putting that all together and combining that with information about hazards and threats, ideally in real time, combining that information with the criticality of your suppliers, an automated assessment program for your supply chain at depth, it allows you to have actionability in a way that limits having to do unnecessary work insofar as I have a whole bunch of suppliers, they're fine, they're not in a threat zone. I have a whole bunch of tertiary suppliers under them, they are in a threat zone, that's where I need to focus my effort. Having systems in place that have all of this information there is what's going to allow you to do this at scale. Otherwise, it's going to remain overwhelming. And so when I say see opportunities for improvement, bringing the data that you need into systems and trying to move beyond a naive process into a little bit more automation is what I think is going to make all these recommendations we're coming up with, you know, which are good things to do, consumable by people who have supply chains at scale.
Great, thank you. And we have had a question come in from an audience member. My company has developed a BCP plan for supply chain operations, mostly focused on the recovery of an event that impacts a specific node. Any ideas on how to evolve this BCP plan to manage a global event such as the pandemic? Obviously, diversification of your manufacturing partners in different countries, etc., comes into play, but any other ideas beyond supplier diversification? Ralph, do you want to take this one?
I would love to, Kimberly. Thank you. The most important thing you can do is have a hub and spoke environment for your corporation. So if something happens, let's say we go back to 2002 and you had the great Northeast blackout where 23 states and 4 provinces in Canada lost power. And you had no way to call from New York to Washington or New York to Georgia or whatever. But if you had a plan in place, you would know that, oh my goodness, the lights are out. We can't contact that office in another city. We know what they're doing. We know that they're intended to do something that we rehearsed with them. They open up their plan, which is not on a PC. It's actually printed in their top drawer. And they're able to say, okay, this is what we need to do, and this is how we're going to go forward. So taking it more specifically, you just want to plan for the eventuality of what's called all hazards planning. We don't plan for a fire or a flood or an earthquake or anything else. We plan for the elements. We plan for the loss of power, which is 78% of the time. It's the loss of power that is the culprit that causes a disaster event. loss of facility, which is number 2, loss of communications. Of course, loss of personnel is always the most important one, but it's not usually ranked as high as power in some of the others. Loss of transportation. You want to make sure you've got all those areas. So you're a company that manufactures shoes, and you have a plant in Buffalo, New York, and you want to ship internationally. So what's involved in that? A manufacturing plan, and even before that, your planning, your scientists, your people that are working on how to do this, and then you've got to do your transportation, your communication, your invoicing, your receivables on the financial side. It gets very, very unwieldy unless you're prepared. So my advice to that individual is to just take it back home, start at home, and roll it out gently to all those organizations. Build upon what you have. I'm thrilled to hear they have a supply chain plan, and I commend that individual for saying that. And I want to know after this call who that was. But seriously, we need to make sure that people have a plan that can go in any direction and can accommodate whatever needs that they might encounter.
Great, thank you, Ralph. Erin or Eric, do you have anything to add to Ralph's response?
I mean, people often, go ahead, Aaron.
No, please go ahead, Eric.
People often assess the risk of their supply chain nodally because they have to, because it's too much work, right, to assess it systemically. You identify critical activities of your suppliers, you do nodal assessment, in this case of business continuity, but it could be any kind of risk, because that's the amount of time you have, right? You have to rate and rank them. Applying a systemic approach to this with some automation can help with that, such that you can have actionable information if you have an understanding of the global reach of a particular supplier, which I think was what this question was interested in. What do I do for a global threat to a particular supplier? Just knowing what they're doing for you and where in a systemic way, such that you can have actionable risk assessment, can get you past that. I know what the most critical activity is, and I only have time to assess that. I'm not saying that was the case here, but that's commonly the reason for a rated and ranked nodal risk assessment like that.
All right, thank you. And Erin?
Yeah, Eric, I just wanted to actually tie on to what you were saying, both about scalability in your first comment, and also the understanding that you need to have the right information, not all the information, right? So there's lots of information floating out there. So Eric, I really like that you talked about, making sure that you had the right data and information, that somebody has that, use automation, and make sure you have real-time information coming in. And that there are still things like your computer is still charged even when you lose power, or it should be. We have chargers, especially those of us that live in hurricane zones or tsunami zones, know how to work without some of the power, but still need to be planning. The other piece, though, that I want to add is that there is this idea that with continuity planning, we're going to be able to sustain operations at this base level, and everything is going to be progressing. It's going to be uncomfortable, but we're going to make it work. I think that one of the things that the pandemic has shown is that there will be a contraction. There will be a contraction. We need to limit that contraction. We need to limit the impact, and we need to understand that as a company, what is a suitable level of contraction in productivity or contraction, and that we can live with and live through so that we can grow on the other side, so that we can bounce forward. Because the other thing that we need to realize is, as we're dealing with this really long-term event, this pandemic, in your continuity of operations, you need to be considering battle fatigue from dealing with this, both as a human, you're homeschooling, you're doing your job, you're doing all these other things, plus society is having a large impact on us. So these are things that your plan should consider that they might not have been considering before. And your target for success might significantly change when we're talking about an event that does not have a definitive start and end, and it does not have a definitive geography. That is very, very complex. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by it, that's okay. But everybody is feeling overwhelmed by that. But the solutions are going to have to come in collaboration, making sure you have the right data and that you're getting the information you need in a timely and effective fashion. So,
That's
I
great.
could speak forever on that, so I'll just stop.
And we'll touch on some more of this as we go forward as well. But just going now sort of into bouncing forward, what are some of the things to consider today to prepare for tomorrow? And we thought a good place to start would be the smaller suppliers. So Ralph, I know you're passionate about supporting SMBs with preparedness. And considering that many second, third, and end-tier suppliers may be small businesses, what are some of the unique requirements of the SMB, and what should SMBs be doing now to prepare?
Thank you, Kimberly. I think the most important thing that small businesses, and that could be said less than 25 million US dollars or 100 employees or 1 or 2 locations, can be sliced in a bunch of different directions. But the most important thing to know is that there are plans available, comprehensive, actionable, detailed business continuity plans available for those folks. They can get them online off the internet at no cost. They can spend a couple $100s and get them a little more mature, a little more functional, a little more thinking, that are able to reach into a couple of different areas for $500 or so. But the key is that the plans are available, and these people need to do that. I know where I come from, the backbone of many, many areas is the small business. And I had a client who was a building firm in one of the major cities in the Northeast that was building a large office tower, 50 stories or higher. And they had a $900 million budget. And 10% of their spend needed to be on the small businesses, on the ones that were in one of several minority areas. And they had spent $90 million with these firms. And they had 200 of these firms that they engaged as resources for them. In certain areas where perhaps they weren't the steel manufacturer or the concrete deliverer, but they had someone that was going to be someone that can handle catering or security or transportation of some sort. And what happens if they didn't show up, if there was a situation where they couldn't respond to a disaster event because they did not have a plan? So the company actually vetted the small business suppliers to make sure that they had plans so they could count on them to be there to make sure that they met certain standards, they adhered to the specifications of the project, they met the deadlines, they did the reporting, and they had small plans. So this whole cornerstone for these organizations was really more about communication than anything else, about communication, about reporting, about doing whatever they can to work with different organizations. And another term evolved from that over the last couple of years that we've not discussed yet on this call, and that's workflow optimization. So when you have a business, as Erin just said, you're not going to go back to your complete 100% optimization of making widgets on day 2. It might take 2 weeks, it might take 2 months. You may never go back. Look at the numbers of some of the restaurants that are being closed now due to the pandemic that may never open again because they just haven't had the way to maintain their business and maintain their staff during this period of time. But workflow optimization means that you're able to do things now that you would do if there was a disaster event. So another client of mine in Connecticut had an organization that had a report that everyone got on Monday morning. And they all wanted this report in their own specific ways. One had 5 common elements, one had 7 common elements, one had 12 common elements. So we looked at that report, we polled those organizations, we came up with a standard report that they all could use now and especially after a disaster event. So the small businesses have to adopt the large business practices. The resources are available. The costs are nominal, but the value is tremendous to keep them in business and keep them as a key part of the overall supply chain.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Ralph. I think that the other thing that comes up a lot and that has really been exposed as an area for improvement is visibility. Sort of one thing that the coronavirus pandemic has exposed is the lack of visibility deeper into supply chains, into the second tier, third tier, end tier, and beyond. So, Eric, what do organizations need to be considering in regard to supplier information mapping?
Well, you have to have the information in the first place, right? The primary challenge with this is, who are my suppliers' suppliers? Often we find that someone in our clients knows. It's somewhere out there because they have their supply chain mapped, usually in some sort of manufacturing automation system if it's a manufacturing, or some sort of logistics system if it's logistics. If it's IT or InfoSec suppliers, usually that's they've asked as part of their IT and InfoSec assessment, because that's been common in that sector for a while. But those pieces of information are sitting around in all of those disparate systems. And so getting that information to the people who are working on pandemic risk, who are working on, natural disaster risk, just business continuity in general. It's hard for them to get a hold of that information sometimes, because right at the beginning of this, we were talking about silos, right? Those information remain siloed in their systems. Like I said, that, if it's manufacturing, they remain siloed in manufacturing systems. Getting a hold of that information, getting it into whatever risk management system you have, making sure that your risk management system is capable of modeling your supply chain in that way, right? And isn't just sort of a flat Rolodex of businesses, which is still pretty common. These are going to be critical in order to have visibility into threats and hazards that are below the first level of your supply chain. Otherwise, you're going to be back to not being able to operate at scale, right? You're going to be back to rating and ranking. You're going to be looking at your critical suppliers and maybe asking just them, hey, do you have sub-suppliers that you think are critical? And then you're going to have big gaps in your analysis of your overall risk.
Great, thank you. And Erin, related to this, how does hazard monitoring support this? And can you talk us through the kinds of maps we're seeing here, and perhaps share some examples from experience where having these early warning signals have helped support better outcomes?
Absolutely. Eric kind of set it up very nicely there. You have to have the right information, and you many times it's siloed. And but what you're looking at here actually in the top is part of our data and information that we cover globally in disasterware that shows you real-time hazards that are happening around the world, but not just natural hazards. So it wasn't, it wasn't COVID that got us covering pandemics. We've been covering biological, biomedical hazards. We cover 20 some different hazard types, including civil unrest, which can impact your supply chain, earthquakes that can impact your supply chain, tsunami. So we bring all of that relevant information together and then marry it effectively with the information that the companies, agencies, organizations have on where are their suppliers, right? And then alert them, make sure that they know that you have a threat. And many times information can be overwhelming. So you need to make sure that when you're alerting, which is what you're looking at in the top screen, all the different hazards in real time. I really only care about the ones that are in red. That tells me population, or in your case, it might be business, is going to potentially be impacted, and I need to do something. That's where that action-oriented information, you can have all the data in the world, but if you're not driven towards an action that will protect you and your business, then we're not in the right space. We're not doing the right thing. And then general awareness, so we can have both immediate, quick onset events like those earthquakes or potentially civil unrest, a bombing, active shooter, those type of quick pieces, but then also the progression. So we were monitoring COVID before, right at the beginning of the first of the year, and we were getting reports at the end of the year. We've got this thing we really need to watch in China. We've got to watch what's going on. Here are the reports. This information was available and out there. And when you intersect it, when you bring it together with the supply chain data and you put it in a modern way, I don't know how many of you are sitting there with your phone right next to you. I know I am. Get the information to the people the way they need it in a mobile setting so that they can take action. So really that's what all of my research and science and effort is guided towards. The right information at the right time, so you know what happened, where did it happen, how bad is it, and what do I need to do? And those are the four pieces that we try and answer.
Great, thank you. And that sort of tracks into digitization as well. The World Economic Forum has highlighted the importance of digitization of information about and across supply chains. So Eric, what kind of data could and should be digitized, and what's the value of automation in this process?
What kind of data can be digitized? I mean, the structure of your supply chain, your business continuity planning, your business continuity assessment, all of these things can and should be digitized. I mean, garner immense benefits from all of this, but just in terms of, what Ralph was talking about, in terms of small businesses, just having appropriate scoping of business continuity assessment is something that large businesses can do to help small businesses improve their business continuity stance. We're still in a world where a lot of small businesses are being sent the same sort of one-size-fits-all business continuity assessment, which is fine in terms of a first step. But if I'm running a software company, which I am, right, then going through your sort of manufacturing resiliency part of your business continuity assessment isn't that useful to me. Digitization of this process allows scoping to come into play here. Scoping allows you to, one, just lower the overall amount of work that goes into this whole thing throughout this network of buyers and suppliers, and thus, two, get better information back. And then three, be able to act on it in an appropriate, scoped, and actionable way, like Aaron keeps saying. That's just one of a million different benefits of digitization here. Digitizing the structure of your supply chain allows you to, in an automated way, assess the structural risks of your supply chain. It allows you to apply analytical models and AI to that structure and decide where you have to take action. Once again, like Aaron said, all of these are just ways of operating at scale such that you take, what's a relatively basic process, digitize it, and then you can apply it, as appropriate, scoped appropriately, and with automation to a very large number of players.
Right, thank you.
Are we allowed to say amen? Is that?
I think we can.
Yes.
I think we can. We can breathe now.
Yeah,
yes.
We're probably preaching to the converted here. Which really brings us to collaboration as well. Collaboration, and drawing things out of silos is just so central to successful supply chain resilience. So, Ralph, what practical advice do you give clients about collaborating with suppliers?
It's absolutely probably the one message that's the most critical coming out of this meeting. And let me give you an example of that. To prepare for this webinar today, we had several calls, a bunch of emails, and a bunch of things going back and forth because our three companies together, between Disaster Aware, Aravo, and Readiness Associates, are all in this together. Just like you all are with your own companies. For the folks that are listening, you've got your own products that you sell, your services you provide, be it a healthcare organization or any other organization, and you've got your network of dependencies and people around you. And you've got to take a look at what's around you and what decisions you need to make. Treat everyone the same. All your suppliers. That company that was getting to build that large 50-story plus building in the northeastern city treated their smallest security provider as importantly as their largest steel provider, because if one domino did not fall, it created a situation that was very, very possibly a negative situation. So you're getting to a point where you're taking notes, you're listening, you're finding out what's new, you're seeing what new ideas come out, you're looking at standards, you're looking at public and private sector cooperation and coordination. As Eric said, the digitizing, having that information done in more of a workflow environment, in a easy flow, a flow chart, something that's a pattern that you can follow and look for the exceptions that are easily identifiable. Those are all critical. So I think that the most important thing about collaborating is just having a process and following it. And who is it? Ben Franklin said that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So we have to always remember that as well.
Right, thank you, Ralph. We do have a question that's come in from the audience. How do we encourage or enforce visibility so that the suppliers will share with us their BCP strategy and their own critical suppliers?
That's a generalized supply chain management question that's applicable to sort of any information you need from your suppliers. Also, it's a little bit two different questions. Collaborating with your suppliers is how you do the first one, right? Like we have you are a critical supplier for us. We have a business relationship. Someone at the buyer cares about that supplier, right? Because it's critical to their line of business. At that buyer, that person is going to be the ideal person to reach out, speak with their suppliers, make a human connection around, business continuity. Because look, if your business is disrupted, our business is disrupted. We're in this together, right? And so that's right in the spirit of this slide that we have right here. And that's really true for, business continuity and other threat oriented topics, right? Because it's a little easier sometimes to make a human connection around that than, say, for example, InfoSec assessment, which is often a little different. In terms of who their critical suppliers are, starting with, it's the same thing, right? Having a human connection with your suppliers, having a business relationship that's healthy, but also sometimes people just don't think of it. It's still a situation that comes up where, who my suppliers are, is that relevant to the questions that I am answering for you in an assessment about business continuity? And if so, how so? Often just a reminder of that makes all the difference these days. There is improving awareness about the depth and fragility of supply chains in the world out there, but I think as we are seeing right now, it is certainly not universal.
Thank you. Which kind of really takes us to agility, which is sort of the end game, and the ability to be more agile is really at the heart of better supply chain resilience. So how should organizations be looking to build agility into their continuity planning? Maybe Ralph, if we start with you.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. I think the word agility has been around a long, long time, but now it's become extremely fashionable because people have to be agile. And what are the synonyms? Flexible, prepared, motivated, enthusiastic. You can't have someone that is going to be somewhat mundane or somewhat close in their thought process and thinking of all the possibilities of things that could happen in different scenarios. You don't want to drive yourself crazy and plan for every possible scenario. But as I said earlier, you look at the all hazards planning, you look at the elements, the communications, the power, the transportation, all the other areas, and everybody's got to build this into their planning in their departments. So that when something does go wrong, so when, as Eric said, he's running a software business, when something happens that affects the livelihood of his business or a department thereof, they know what to do. Those people know what to do on the front line. Management has given them the approval and the authority, because you're not going to be trying to call back for permission when the phone lines are down or when the power's out. And everybody needs to have the copies of the plan. So everybody, the word agility to me is that everybody's on the same page. Everyone has been trained and understands the processes. And let me give you a healthcare example. So Readiness Associates is focused significantly on the healthcare area. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to provide solutions to make everything easier, to make sure that the ability to communicate, the ability to back up your data, to build planning and so forth and so on. But you can only do as much as you can leading the horse to water to make sure that they can do it. But people have to take that action and have to go forward. And that's where the regulations come in that say, here's the process to follow. And if you don't follow it, you're going to be in trouble.
So Erin, what are some of the opportunities for better collaboration, for instance, between government agencies and the industry here?
I think this is a really important one. Technology is first and foremost. Government is not agile, and it has been built not to be agile. It's steady state, which means the leaders in the field are going to be coming from industry, and it's going to come from technology and the ability to apply new modeling capabilities, new data, big data, to complex problems. And so I think the thing that we're seeing right now, especially in the US government, the US military, as well as foreign governments, is for business and industry to bring solutions that can be applied to multiple problem sets. And I think when you look at supply chain and, the work, Eric, really that you and the company are doing applies directly to US military, the Defense Logistics Agency, largest, supply chain globally, trying to move goods from point A to point B. They need a technology update. They need to be able to see these things in real time. I think the other piece for agility, if I could give you a crystal ball and say, these are all the things that you'll experience in 2020, this would have been nice for all of us. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do have really good predictions. We do have, tons of data and analysis that is traditionally applied to the government for planning that should also be applied to the business industry. So this is where I see that partnership between the two. But right now we are primed for a solid partnership between business and industry, especially the integration of solid technology to solve problems, and the government, because the resources don't exist and the capacity and capability is significantly decreased. And I'll say right now, this is the question that we're having with FEMA, with the National Geospatial Agency, with the Department of Defense, because they're still dealing with COVID. We are now starting on Monday, the start of hurricane season, right? So I think for agility, we must be maintaining strong scientific information and marrying that with the best in technology and validated, vetted data sources, because that is the winning combination in my eyes.
And fantastic, thank you, Erin. And maybe just to close, we're just coming up to the hour now. Eric, how can a supplier ecosystem become more agile?
Iteratively, right? The the fundament of agile software development, which is my area, right, is to do things iteratively. It's to have, minimally acceptable results, iterate, take a look at how you're doing. It's called retrospecting, and then iterate again. I mean, we're talking about a massive maturation, right, from where we are now, as we are seeing in terms of people's understanding of the business continuity risks in their supply chain. And, Ralph and Erin talked about a lot of structural agility stuff there, all of which is absolutely right, and so I won't belabor it. But getting there, like we all mentioned before, don't get overwhelmed, right? Come up with phases, right? Phase 0 is just what Ralph said. If there's small businesses in your supply chain, have them do an off-the-shelf business continuity assessment. It helps everybody, right? And just call it that. If there's phase 2, get to your second tier of suppliers, right? If there's phase 3, put in place automation. Right? If there's phase 4, start to bring in all sorts of real-time data and take, agile action on all of that. It doesn't all have to happen at once, because doing this can be overwhelming, which is the opposite of agility. Don't think that this is a project that you have the big bang, and get a hold of all at once just because it seems like the biggest thing right now.
Great, thank you. So we've managed to answer a few questions from the audience over the course of the presentation today. But I'd really like to thank the contributions of our panelists. I think there were some great insights there to share. I think there was a lot there that will help us sort of take this principle of bouncing forward and looking at what we can do to be better in the future. And just finally, before I close, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Aravo has developed an integrated supply chain resilience solution, which helps address many of the challenges covered today. We've partnered with Disaster Aware, which take data from the Pacific Disaster Center. They're a cloud-based risk intelligence platform for monitoring global hazards. And because we have this integrated solution, you can start to overlay your supplier mapping with your hazard mapping. The solution helps you proactively identify risks, automate business impact assessments, and trigger action plans. It means you can prevent, defend against, respond to, and recover from supply chain disruptions with more agility and transparency. And you can find out more about this in the website. For any questions that you may have submitted that we didn't get to today, we'll make sure that we follow up with you directly. And again, thanks very much for your participation today, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Kimberly. Good job to everyone.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Aloha.
All right. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Everyone, thank you.
Thank you.